That was, I saved some of the.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started, for this particular meeting. Since this is a formal meeting, I think we need to go through the agenda. We have an agenda, we need public comment and pledging and all that stuff. I apologize if you saw that. As I stand here and I look at Lloyd, like, Chairman, do you want to call the meeting to order?
Yes, I'll call the meeting to order. Can you call the roll?
Chairman Lloyd.
Present.
Vice Chair.
Present.
Let's see.
And Gino?
David Villa.
Yes.
Gino.
Here.
Bob.
Here.
We have four. Thank you. If you'd stand and join me in the pledge.
Mike's all right.
You want to lead us?
Ready? Salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Yeah, this time I'll open up public comment. Public comment. Seeing that, I'll close public comment. We'll go on to item 3.
Awesome. So we also, this is a joint workshop, board workshop and TAC workshop, the Technical Advisory Committee, to be able to discuss the groundwater allocation policy that was released last Friday as a draft for consideration for adoption by the board. We now, I believe, have a forum for Technical Advisory Committee also, which will allow Technical Advisory Committee to, as a result of this meeting, any kind of formal recommendation to bring forward to the board and present at a future board meeting. The intent here, obviously, of this conversation is to have a lot of back and forth and dialogue about questions, about interaction, thoughts, refinements, and just get more dialogue on this policy between TAC, which is a formal Technical Advisory Committee, to the MSGSA, and for the board to be able to listen and then also have conversations back as members of the board. The intent would be that no later than the August 8th meeting of this the GSA board, this allocation policy as amended by that time will be considered for adoption. I say no later than, it probably will be on that date, but there is the reservation for a potential special meeting at the end of July. However, that's, I think at this point, highly unlikely to occur. The board meeting on July 11th will be an open meeting for public comment before the board will convene and further discuss the policy. So with that, I think the intent is really to have a discussion about this policy. There are copies up here, hard copies up in the corner if you didn't get one, and have a conversation between TAC. We'll also allow, I think if you're a member of the public, please raise your hand and we'll invite your comment in. I think we have to be following a little bit of the formalities of the TAC and the board for conversation, but we want the input from everybody who also is participating. So if you are either in the room or online, a member of the public and not a member of the Technical Advisory Committee, please just raise your hand and we'll get around to you and get thoughts and input, because that's super important to have also. So with that, well, let me add that I'm here also. Ashley and I are here to be able to provide additional explanation about what's here right now. If it's helpful, the board can also elaborate on why certain provisions are in here and where it stands at this point. So I kind of open it up and invite the interactive conversation with members of the board. I don't know if any board member in particular wants to first opine anything before we move over to the TAC or something. So any some other people. So Lloyd, is there anything you want to start or defer to other members of your board for any questions?
Yeah, no, I mean, just what Greg said, this is important, and we just want to get as many eyes on it, have discussion as we can, so that we don't miss anything, and we have the opportunity to change things before it's adopted. It's important. Any other board members wanna? Nick?
Well, that's it now. We're going through it, yeah.
All right.
But I am glad this has been able to happen, right? This meeting is long overdue, right? Getting it back together with the board and everyone can feel like they can talk frank and. Yeah, everyone's at the same table, so it's a good thing, so.
Ashley, do we have people online participating?
Yes, around 24 people.
Okay.
They can hear us, if you will, with the mic.
So you know, they, according to Brianna, as long as we aren't talking over each other, all of these mics will pick up every conversation that's going on. So maybe we should go through for the benefit of both in the room who may not be able to see online, we can read through that list, but also go around the room and make introductions, so folks online, because there is no video feed, knows who is in the room here. I think
Actually, Chen Gonzalez, we're Subbasin.
Greg Young was Zan Harrow, consultant to Merced Subbasin GSA.
Mark Ferrellier. Jim Polly, MSGSA board member.
Brian Vandenberg, Merced County Farm Bureau Executive Director.
Gino Pedretti, Merced GSA board member.
Nick Farkini, Vice Chair, Merced Subbasin GSA.
Lou Myers, TAC member and grower on the east side. Jeff Bannon, Hubel with Milk Producers Council.
Lloyd Pereira, Chair of the MSGSA board.
Craig Johnson, farmer and member of the Amsterdam Water District.
Ben Crane, farmer and member of Amsterdam Water District.
Brad Samuelson on the TAC. Clayton Ravino, member of the TAC, farmer in Stevenson.
Dave Nervino with MSGSA board member.
Bob Kelly, TAC member.
Lisa Baker, farmer and member of Clayton Water District.
Scott Menefee, farmer and member of Clayton. So we have, assuming you guys, well, maybe your eyes are better than my eyes, you can see who's on the list, we can look at everybody who's on the call-in, we have, obviously us as the host, and Danielle with the county, providing some support services, a couple of phone numbers, we don't know, Adriel Ramirez from Zan Harrow, Betty Hurley Lindeman, Chris Hepner with BKI, David Hobbs, David Orth, Ellen Ware, Jeannie Zalezi, so council for GSA, Kendall Darnell, a Marquine Water login, Mike Gallo, Ramona Saunders, Rob Steiner, John Brophy, Spencer, Terra Ag Ventures, Vince, Yama Al Ahmed, and George Park. So everybody has a good sense of who's online and who's in the room now, so. Maybe turn it over to TAC, is there anybody within TAC that wants to make any initial conversations or talk specifically? Happy to address this in any way, we want to go through provision by provision, you have some big points you want to address, let's just jump into it and figure out what works best.
Well, so you don't jump around, why don't you sort of lead through provision by provision so we don't jump all over?
I had a feeling you were gonna say that. I think first off, we did add this note at the very front, I think it's super important. This particular set of rules and regulations, it's to govern agricultural groundwater users in the GSA that will begin in January 2026. So while it's being considered for adoption by the GSA board on or before August 8th, the intent is to provide the vital information to the state of California as part of our update to our Sigma compliance groundwater sustainability plan, which is due in January of next year. Back updates and get public drafts and everything. We essentially need to write summaries of this material for that document within the next 30 to 60 days. The other aspect of this will allow refinements and continued considerations and conversations as this acts as a pilot phase of implementing this allocation policy during 2025. I believe everybody in this room that is a grower or an owner of land, of agricultural land, received an invite to the groundwater accounting platform and PIN.
Is that true? Is anybody a grower who did not receive a pin? We had a workshop yesterday morning that worked through some of those. That was helpful. There's other ongoing assistance. There's a posted video and discussion of that workshop from yesterday that could be helpful, and the GSA staff is available to continue to assist. That platform is super important because it is providing a pilot of what the allocation and the tracking would start to look like, as if it's starting now and going into next year. But this allocation won't start to apply. Everything will be cleared out, zeroed out, started fresh for January 2026. That's how it's currently set.
To make a comment about that, Greg, with everybody receiving their pins. We've had people in Stevenson ask the question, well, might I have to use a computer to work on this program? Because I don't have one. Everyone needs to be aware that at some level that there are people that are gonna need assistance of how to deal with that. So we're gonna, what should we be telling them? Should we tell them, oh, eventually you'll have to get in touch with GSA staff and make an appointment and go down and visit them? How are we gonna handle that? That's gonna come up.
These are obvious, real issues that we have to address, and I think there's a variety of solutions. Probably the most practical would be to set an appointment with the GSA and have a visit in office to look at the parcel and look at what's there and make sure they're understanding everything.
Right.
I think alternatively, there's other pathways. I think, Brad, your firm is assisting people in various ways to.
Well, we manage several districts and we'll be working with our grows.
So there's some of those things are also happening, so that people within it might not all log on or even have a computer because it's being outsourced. So there's a couple pathways, but I do think at a minimum, contacting the GSA to help.
You got hair until he retires.
That's measured in days.
Yeah, hours.
Yeah.
So with that, that caveat, that context about when this is applicable, what this purpose of this rule is now, is to really understand how this is going to be deployed. It's useful to tell the state what we are doing, that we have made the advancements we said we would make in our last plan. We said there's gonna be a big demand reduction program implemented by this GSA with no details. Now this will provide the details with the hopeful intent that helps DWR again approve and continue allowing us to have local control over our destiny of implementing actions to comply with signal. So that's
Once we present it to DWR, though, it could take them a year to get back to us with an approval, right? So our timelines, we're gonna continue our timelines as proposed,
yes.
figuring that we're in the ballpark. And hopefully it'll all come together.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So following on the direction from Mr. Nervino about walking through there, the first couple sections talk about the purpose and authority. If you want to scroll. We have any questions about that purpose? Okay, so purpose and authority, and then it goes to section 1.3, and there is several pages of definitions. These definitions are important, and we can refer back to them as we are looking at elements of the policy, because the policy uses terms that are then defined in these prior sections. So I don't want to go through all these right now, because I'm guessing we're going to be revisiting them as we work through some of the policy itself. By show of hands in this room, I think it would be helpful for me who has read the policy in its entirety. Pretty much everybody. Okay, that's good. So you at least know what it entails. It's got a fair amount of. Okay. Lou?
Go ahead.
We table the question. Let's have the question, but we may not answer it. Yeah, this is a meeting between the TAC and the boards. We want to have that conversation, and then additional public input. Let's get hands raised and let's make sure we're coming back to it. But I want to be focused with the board and the TAC first. That makes sense. So when we get into section 1.4, groundwater allocation eligibility. Also note that a lot of the context here, this is providing the details of the framework released last February, outlining kind of the generalities of what's intended for the allocation approach, and then some numbers that were made available April, not forgetting. Brad, like you might know, April. I think it was around April when the initial sustainable yield of native groundwater and the APA numbers were released. April. So this provides a little formality of that and provides further definition as has been developed within an ad hoc committee of the board. So the groundwater eligibility, allocation eligibility lays out 3 primary land use types of agriculture. That's irrigated ag lands, managed wetlands, and grazing lands, as each of those are defined in the definition section related to codes recognized by the assessor's office. And so that's the information we have to start with, and that's where we're starting this whole process. I'm gonna just point to the back as an list of appeals topics. Those are not detailed out yet, but there are going to be situations where lands are misclassified. There's an appeals approach to be able to address those things. And it just hasn't been fully defined, but the intent would be if it's misclassified, we just have to get it classified correctly. There might be outstanding fees that are due associated with that to the GSA. And whether or not to the county, that's a different story. We're not the assessor's office. We can handle their issues. Then we move into the next section, starts talking about all of those. Who gets what kind of water under those different allocations? So if you're irrigated agriculture, you're going to get the availability of what's called SYNG, so that's sustainable yield of native groundwater. And then you're also going to get an APA, that's an additional pumping allowance. So if you're irrigated land currently as recognized by the county assessors designations, you will have availability of sustainable yield in the APA for the entirety gross area of each one of your parcels. Your managed wetlands, it describes a couple of different methods for the quantification of the water you have eligible as a managed wetland designation. There are 2 pathways there. One method is very similar to what irrigated ag has, but you only get the additional pumping allowance associated with a footprint of active wetlands versus getting the APA for an entirety of your gross parcel. The other method that's in here allows more water to be available so long as there is a promise to continue to manage the wetland as a wetland. And there's documentation that have to be provided to be able to demonstrate what that quantity would be. But it is consistent with pending legislation that's trying to assure that migratory or managed wetlands are having adequate water supplies through SGMA implementation, and they aren't tremendously impacted. So there's different method that allows for some of that. Then grazing land, the way grazing land is set up right now, you get you have an opt-in requirement that if you want to take grazing land, and that again, as defined by the assessor of certain types of parcels, essentially those that are not irrigated and haven't been irrigated since 2015. And so here we have the fine period if it was not having water use between these periods of time. You will opt in, you are going to be looking to pay some sort of fees, and then you will have the availability of the sustainable yield times the acreage associated with that parcel that is opting in. There's a further constraint on those lands that says you'll have to put a well on that land, and you need to use the water only on that land. And that is not eligible to now shift to other lands. So you can't go, for instance, purchase lands that are unirrigated and create more yield for yourself and then shift it over to other lands that are currently irrigated. It's the intent of how that is set up right now. I'm gonna pause as we kind of go through some of these major sections. So 1.4, let's pause there for a minute and have a conversation. Any thoughts, comments, concerns? First TAC. And then we go public.
I have comments, as always.
Hi.
I think that the intent is well suited. I agree with the language. I agree with the approach. I am concerned, as I have been for some time, that the lack of development of the appeal language now creates a lot of uncertainty for growers. Myself particularly, I've got a particular circumstance where this gives me a lot of heartburn that I can get into in a second. But all in all, I would encourage more development. I know we're under a tight gun, or the board's under a tight gun, and maybe we just can't, the board can't. I'd encourage more development of the appeal rules instead of leaving those as to be determined later, because the lack of certainty for growers. I have a particular circumstance, some of you guys know about it, where we have a piece of ground. It is currently designated as cattle, I believe, been irrigated since before I was born. In fact, EKI is using that as a well, one old well there for well monitoring. We drilled 2 brand new wells on the ground in 2017, set up our pumping station and irrigation lines to those wells. And then we have not done anything since then because we were waiting to see how these rules would come out. We did apply a tiny bit of water for 1 year, but I am concerned that that would be designated as rangeland. Obviously, we've got a lot of financial investment in that one piece of property. We got the pumping station going all the way to that piece of property. And these wells were drilled again, 2017. County's got the records, county approved them, county inspected them. So as the language currently reads, absent appeal language that's defined, I'm put in a precarious spot with that.
Could we see where this is, the appeal section?
Sorry, the appeal section starts on section 1.11. And there is a list of appeal type topics. First one being groundwater allocation eligibility with a couple of suggested subsets. The next one, groundwater allocation types and amounts. So essentially it's.
You have a page?
It's page 24. It's the last page.
All right.
Look to the back.
Yeah, I thought it was being internally.
Yeah.
Before we get too far going down the appeal process, I mean, shouldn't we go through it like we're going? I mean, is it applicable to 1.4 really right now?
I would agree with simply pointing out the appeals that was here, and then let's come back to that track. We have a note of desire for that. And I think the board maybe can give some suggestions as to the timing and the ability to address some of these, but you can see there are lots of appeal classes. This kind of goes, the reason I want to point that out is it goes to the timing, how much that you really can adopt and incorporate, not adopt, but actually draft and feel confident with prior to adoption of the policy as again, a functioning policy at our August 11th for purposes of informing the DSP and what we're submitting to the state. Well, we have time to continue to work on other pieces before this actually becomes real. So I know that always sounds weird in my mind, that it's like adopt something that's not fully drafted. Well, it sounds funky. And I get that, but I'm trying to find that sweet spot where we can match enough information that everybody understands the main intents, while knowing there's some more details that have to get worked out, like details on potential appeals, without delaying the ability to adopt something for the informing the GSP. So with that, there's a lot of appeal concepts. That's where it is, Bob, to answer your question. When I come back, and are you made your point on that? Is there another comment?
Other questions about my circumstance, I guess.
A section part of that has, it also talks about appeal acreage is 1.4.2.1.3. And that one confuses me. I think we went past that, but
Say the number again, please, Bob.
1.4.2.1.3. It's really.
This page
Oh.
9.
That was in connection with the original 218.
What's that?
That was in connection with the original Prop 218. So at that point, if you had a piece of property that wasn't wall to wall planted, you could have opted out paying the extra 218 fee and gotten designated non-irrigated. And so that's just tying that acreage to future, I mean,
Is that correct?
Yeah, that was, so we had. Got how many acres appealed, but there were some acres that appealed and were able to provide a refund. And they went through a process, and as part of agreeing to that refund, they agreed that their acres would no longer be determined for purposes of sustainability as the entirety of the land. The gross acres of the parcel would be restricted to the acres they were, they had appealed for paying the fee. So it essentially made a smaller parcel because they didn't want to pay for the entire parcel because they weren't farming the entire thing. So that exists, that appeal process exists again. It's still, it's not gone away. It was not sunsetted. It exists if other people want to go down that path. That is on the website, somewhere on the GSA's website, that whole form and the requirements. So that's what that addresses, that helps.
That's a question that's related to the parcels that are partially grazing and partially irrigated. If you're talking about the allocation due to that parcel, because part of it is irrigating. And when you talk about the total allocation bucket, it's going to be the same total acre feet, whether it's considered grazing or irrigated. In other words,
Let me see if I can paint an example that kind of, I think I hear what you're asking. Say we have a 100-acre parcel. And that's designated by the assessor as irrigated, but the landowner operates 40 acres is irrigated and 60 acres is just non-irrigated. The entirety of the parcel is recognized as irrigated. Right now, the entirety of the parcel gets sustainable yield and APA for the entirety of the parcel. They've also been paying the phase 1 fee as irrigated land for the entirety of those 100 acres. In some cases, people said, I want to only pay for the 30 irrigated acres. We said, fine, but now you only get a yield allocation as if it's only 30 acres. So they're foregoing some water that they otherwise would have had by bisecting their parcel through a process. So hopefully that helps. So that parcel is really what's assessed as by the county.
okay, all right, thank you.
I have a question along those lines. So what if you had a managed wetlands, 100 acres of managed wetlands alongside of 100 acres of farm ground? Can you move the water back and forth between the two management parcels?
To help make sure we're clear on that, first, Mike, you come as a voice above my head, so it's kind of like God speaking down to me here, so it's kind of a lot. Are you describing both of those as unique parcels or one parcel with two different land functions occurring on that one parcel?
Well, either one. In other words,
Okay, well, let's take them as two unique parcels first. The irrigated land will get sustainable yield and APA and can be joined with other parcels, as we'll discuss later. The other parcel would opt in under one of two methods as managed wetland. If it opts in under method 1, it gets sustainable yield for the entire parcel and APA for the footprint associated with the wetland, and it can be joined with other functioning operation and move water back and forth. If you choose method 2, which would potentially give you more water for the wetland, you cannot move the water off of that parcel to other ag lands.
but you can move the water back and forth between a managed wetlands and the farm ground?
If you choose method 1 for your opt-in for managed wetlands land classification parcel. If that land was fully recognized as a parcel as an irrigated ag, it's all treated as irrigated ag, it's different.
So at the end of that wetland section of method 1, the 142216. The owner operating choosing that one has no obligation to maintain his managed wetlands habitat.
Correct.
And he's used that wetlands habitat to establish his sustainable yield in his APA. So now he can, doesn't need to continue that wetlands, he can go and put it on any other parcel that he has a.
So recognize two things. First of all, the sustainable yield he gets for the entire parcel. Let's say you have a 100-acre parcel and you got 20 acres of it actually operating as pumps groundwater as well. You get sustainable yield for the 100 acres. You get an APA associated with the representing that you are irrigating 20 acres. So the 20 acres would get an APA, and then you have no obligation about continuing to maintain that 20 acres of wetlands. But you don't get the APA for the whole thing. Okay. If you choose method 2, you would get sustainable yield for 80 of those 100 acres would be carved out. And then the 20 acres of that wetland, you'd get a higher number that would be determined on its own. It's a managed wetland quantity. And it has to be used just for that wetland and it cannot move anywhere else. Does that help? We're trying to thread a needle there.
Option 2 is basically just to keep managing your wetland, how you've been managing it. And if you want what's left, if you want to keep on managing your wetland, option 2 is probably better. Option 1 is just if you want to take the water to which you, within the rules, which you feel is best for your operation. But with the state law, if it's passed, option 2 gives us an out where they can still, where we still comply with the state law.
And but sort of unlimited amount of water to that habitat.
For that,
It's not unlimited, it's you have to demonstrate what you provided over the period of time between 2015 and 2020, when you were pumping essentially in a base period. We would grant for that quantity for that.
It does have a trackable amount of water.
Yeah, absolutely, it has to be presented, we have to agree that that is a number, you can't just create and make up something.
No, I deal with got a club that exports water to the wildlife refuges for federal use. There'll be no restrictions on any of that kind of. There doesn't seem to be anything in the policy about exporting water.
To the federal government? The federal, yeah, well,
There
if it's going on the federal, they're gonna be exempt.
I'm gonna pause there for a little bit, we haven't talked about that detail yet. In that situation, that private landowner is going to be governed by the allocation.
Yeah.
Yes. He is going to, we're gonna need to know if there's water going off of that parcel, then they are in violation without giving us the lease agreement or some sort of transfer agreement terms, that we would know that that water is getting pumped and applied to feds. Feds on their own fee title land are exempt and can pump whatever they want. That's because feds don't have to follow state law, but that does not work for easement property at this point in time. The easement and any private party is subject to this allocation.
Yes.
And we're gonna have to, understand those are gonna be one-off edge issues, so we're gonna have to understand and address.
So basically, other documentation is where that takes place. We don't need anything in this policy to address that.
I don't believe so, I think that'll come through monitoring and understanding of that, yeah.
Good, thank you.
I was just gonna follow up on Lou's comment and say that, well, understanding that you're trying to do like we're all trying to do like a 2-phase approval process of this. So that there's gonna be details that can get left out. From a grower's perspective, not knowing those details, they're up until the last day, they're gonna be crying about their issue. So I think that's unavoidable. I do wish that there was more detail about the appeals process, especially in the grazing. I think there's a lot of unique circumstances. Lou's is obviously pretty unique with the infrastructure in place. The other item, and I've talked about it before, is the generational farms that planned to not irrigate their whole ranch, leave some on the side. They're getting penalized in the way this is formed now, which I understand the intent was created, or the intent is to prevent a rush on grazing land to get any kind of sustainable yield, and I get that. I think this protects against it. But then the appeals process lending to the generational farm dilemma should be added. Understanding the unique scenario.
And even though Greg doesn't want to hear this, I don't think fleshing out some of this appeal language will be that hard. I've suggested some of it. I think that, you know, I'm just saying, it's not. We're not climbing a mountain here. So I know there's a shortcut, or we're under the gun bit, but I don't think it's that hard to flesh that out.
So their property is grazing today, then? It's what, it's under the county is grazing today?
So I have one process that's assessed as grazing. It's been irrigated since before I was born. So there's long established history. We drilled 2 new wells and ran a bunch of infrastructure in 2017. County stamped to approve the wells. Without any appeal language here, I'm in a pretty tough spot because I could opt in, but then I can't use any of my infrastructure going there because you have to pump on that ground. And you can't, I've got contract water that I buy elsewhere and I try to wheel that water with my own private infrastructure. I can't wheel the water, I'm in a, without having that established, I'm in a tough ground.
So the wells are on the parcel?
Wells are on the parcel.
Should be irrigated.
Wells were drilled on the parcel. Yeah.
But it's designated by the county as grazing, even though it was historic.
County to change it.
It doesn't matter at this point if it was from 2015 to 2020, if that's the area.
Changes, it changes, right? Great.
We have a section, yeah, there is a section in here, and I'm trying to remember where, but I think what Lou has raised, and discussed this before, so I've understood and looked at it in a little more detail as parts. I do think the option where it says it can now be, if it's been misassessed and go through the appeal and it's now assessed as recognized as something else, like it's being recognized as grazing and it should have been irrigated, and we'll switch it over. I think in some instances there's still a restriction, but I don't know if that's always the case. So one of the options are in here, and I don't remember exactly where it is. I apologize, I don't have this whole thing memorized. Everybody remembers the section that allows if you do change, you get the new designation recognized going forward. That might address, it might already kind of be capital or captured, but if not, we gotta think about more needs to consider if it wants to.
Or you handle the appeals process, but.
I'm trying to understand your situation a little more. You said 2 things. You said it's been historically irrigated, but you said you have 2 wells you're not irrigating it right now. So what are you doing? Are you irrigating part of it, all of it?
Sure.
None of it?
Sure. It was irrigated since before I was born. My
Yes.
grandfather was a cattleman.
Yeah.
Stopped irrigating it at some point because pumping up groundwater was too expensive.
Okay,
So there's a well existing since the 60s or whatever. We drilled 2 new wells there. We're gonna extend our olive rows and ran our pumping station infrastructure there. So we drilled the new wells in 2017. At that time, we decided we just planted it to winter wheat or whatever. We've just been playing winter wheat for the last few years because Sigma was passed in 2014. And we didn't know what the future was before investing in olives. So in our view, we're kind of being good actors by not just pumping up water. And we put in a lot of money into that ground. And if it is categorized as grazing, even though there's 2 ag wells, there's 3 ag wells in the property, but the old ones in the 60s we don't really use anymore. Even though there's 3 ag wells in the property, puts us in a tough spot.
Well, I think that if, like Brad is saying, the intent of our document here is to keep people from going up buying the ground and developing it. A lot of, support ought to be given to the historical people that are multi-generational. And I think, we ought to really look into those people as people that have been good stewards of the country, the ground, and continue.
Thankfully, we have Adriel helping us and he's helped draft a lot of this, so he's listening online. He said, here it is. This is the section when the parcel is misclassified. So this is it's on page 9. These are part of the exception aspect. When the parcel is misclassified, it's determined pursuant to section 1.11.1.1, which is the appeal So we've appealed, we were misclassified. The updated corrected land use classification will be used. So. There's a potential, now, obviously, there's no appeal detail.
The issue is the appeal language.
Right.
I know
So-
that language
Okay,
exists,
so I,
but the
just
issue,
clarify for myself, so the appeal language, if the appeal occurs, if the appeal doesn't allow you to appeal, the process doesn't allow your appeal to be successful. It doesn't matter what this says, if it.
Correct.
And so that's where the devil is in the details of the appeal. Correct. Why you want the details of the appeal.
correct.
Understood. Okay. Thank you, Adriel.
Let's just get
Just
the
one-
appeal thing done.
So one quick question, why didn't you have it reclassified as irrigated when you realized it wasn't classified right?
As far as I know, this was released in February or whenever it was.
Yeah, but we've been having irrigated and non-irrigated land for 5 or 6 years already.
To me, at least, as a technical advisory board member or whatever I am. We didn't understand this framework was coming into play until it was released to us somewhat recently. So for me, I had just assumed because we have wells on the property. And I didn't know that it was misclassified until the GSA came out with their map. And you have the dark parcels as irrigated and the light parcels as rangeland. And my whole life, I just assumed, I guess I just didn't look it up because we have wells on the property, I just assumed. And then when that GSA came up with the dark parcel and light parcel map, that's what cued me. And to be honest, I haven't even double checked the parcel to this day, but I just assumed that that map the GSA came up with is accurate. And that's what cued me that this is classified as rangeland.
Your tax bill didn't cue you.
No,
He's got too many parcels.
no, we've got, whatever, 30.
In Stevenson, we have a lot of people too that came up on the map and they're flabbergasted that their stuff's, not categorized properly. And so we're asking the same questions you are, why didn't you go check your parcels? But they're the same assumptions, well, it's been irrigated forever, we just thought the county got it right.
Yeah, I had a couple approach me and they said, well, I didn't want to pay the extra $350.
That would be,
So.
I think that's fair, and
Yeah.
for posterity here, I'm not trying to circumvent any fees.
Right.
I think bill me the fees, I mean, I'm not trying to, just for posterity there, this was a,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to,
Well, if it was irrigated, it'll end up being irrigated.
but it wasn't irrigated during that winter.
Oh, the window.
Okay, was there the window?
It hasn't been irrigated in a while.
Yeah.
So
We did apply a little bit of water,
So
so
let
I
me
was trying to
bring
look
back,
up the tobacco thing, so I guess we did irrigate it technically.
side conversations are also getting picked up by the microphone, so I'm just noting, if you guys wanna have one, please step outside. I'm not trying to stop that, but I was told that it can get quite hectic. From what Brianna has told us, so. Details on appeal are one of the things that has been brought up with your specific example. I want to, can I ask a question? Well, that's why I want to continue with the board and the TAC on this topic, this section. So yes, I think there's some public both in the room and online that want to continue a conversation on this section before we move.
Yeah, I just was gonna ask question everyone else, how they feel about the grazing lands portion of this policy as it stands now. I mean, that was really a question to all you, and people online as well. I mean, it's a big part of, all these are big parts of the policy, this is a big one too, so.
Yeah, so the summary, let me just hit the summary again on the grazing land. You opt in, you're gonna be paying some sort of back fees, maybe all the way back as far as we can. There might be limits on what 218 allows. And then you are also limited to sustainable yield only. And the water, the well has to be on that property and the water has to be used on that property. That's what it currently says. So next question is about those elements and maybe TAC, any other thoughts on TAC, and then let's go in-room public and let's go online.
I think the thought is to prevent a rush for people to water bank rangeland. If all the property was given an existing water allocation, people would start scooping up rangeland just to triage the water. I think everybody knows that, and I think that that's a mitigant. I think it's an effective mitigant, so I am supportive of it with the asterisks of, in the case of Mr. Crane or some others who used restraint and had the property for a long time and used restraint on groundwater, I think there should be. So legacy property owners who've used restraint on developing, there might be some deference applied to that.
Well, what if we put in a date that the ground had to be owned before a certain? Because we can't just start singling out, we had an appeal process, but you can't really start singling out legacy people, but. If, well, it depends on the tap one, but if it was worded different or not, I guess if the next question is, would you like it worded as constructed or?
I mean, but at least I mean, I have no problem with a date, right? But does that date to stay with that person or does that date to stay with the property forever, right? And then if he sells it, what does that lead to, right? It just gets a little sticky, right? So, yeah.
And thus why the details of an appeal are not fully drafted yet. Things like that. Other thoughts from TAC or board? Yeah, let's go internal on the public. I know we had several, I don't know.
I think,
Okay, TAC first, thank you.
I think we talked about this, when you have a designation of land use at grazing. And there are a number of parcels, you know, that are small, 5, 6, whatever, acres. You're not gonna be putting a well on each one of those and keeping that water there when they're irrigated as a lot. You provide groundwater to that. And I'm not sure how that's gonna work, I mean, in this case.
So.
I'm talking about where you've got.
Yeah.
And like in Stevenson, you got a lot of 5, 10 acre parcels, now you look at them out there, it's all one piece. And you want to opt into grazing. But according to this, each one has to have a well and that groundwater's gotta stay in that parcel. But I don't think that's realistic.
In the appeals, one of the appeal types besides the improper assessor land use classification. Knowing details are not there, but concepts of what those are there for is for that kind of situation. There's also the listed coordinated ag well usage for multiple small acre opt-in grazing parcels.
Which one's that?
It's on page 24. 1.11.1.2, so it's the second one under groundwater allocation eligibility, under the appeals, be drafted. Bob, you have, you're consistent in bringing that up, so I appreciate that. We did capture that as a category of potential appeal. There is no detail there, but that was to address that concern that you had brought up before, where somebody may own 2 10-acre parcels. They're separate APNs. Seems silly to have to go on each. How exactly, what kind of limitations are put in there, what that appeal looks like. Obviously, details matter. Those aren't gonna be 1,000 acres as 2 small parcels. It's gonna have to be something realistic.
Okay.
Other TAC thoughts? Okay, I wanna go, anybody, public in the room first? Comments on those, kind of these topics here related to eligibility?
I have a question that's in this, and I don't know if it's appropriate or not, the GIS acreage. And maybe it's just a personal problem of mine, and maybe it's more of a staff, but when I logged in yesterday, my acreage and my parcels are all off. And is that because of this GIS acreage, or how did GIS acreage calculated?
Yeah, fair question.
And my understanding was it was supposed to be the assessed acreage. So if it's all irrigated.
First up, clarification, when you say you logged in and they were off, were they off shifted like when you looked at it visually, or off in total quantity?
The total quantity was off, but each parcel was off differently, some were off like 2.5%, some were off 15%.
So my understanding, and okay, you can answer that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the open ET acreage is just the actual polygon, I guess,
That's not the question.
Okay, I think that's what he's saying, because what's on the platform is essentially what's off of open.
No, it's the APN data, but the APN, and we may have to ask Adriel. The APN is an assessor data, and the assessor data has a gross parcel and a GIS number. The county records a GIS number. And that's what we're using is their GIS number. It's been what has been used for the fee structure historically. And if Adriel unmuted, Adriel, can you clarify Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, you're fine. So when the tax assessor provides a GSA with data every year, they're updating us with changes in landowners, any splits that occur via like a standard Excel file that has those assessed acreages listed as well as GIS acres. Where the GIS acres come into play is that the assessor's office also gives us basically a map of all the polygons on the parcel. And just due to the nature of how the GIS data is generated, you do see some changes between what's assessed and then what is being projected on the platform.
I think there's two items going on. One is a visual offset. Sometimes the map, like when you click on a parcel, it looks like it's shifted over and maybe not aligning. The other, I think you're asking, Scott, is about the total.
Actually, for the allocation, I always understood it was gonna be based on our assessed acre.
Right, so right now we're defining it as GIS acres and they're defined here in the definitions. I knew we'd go to definitions at some point. There's a definition for the GIS acres. We are on, who finds it first?
Page 4.
Some page 4. There we go. Geographic information system, parentheses, GIS acreage is calculated acreage of a parcel using GIS system as provided by the county in conjunction with legally defined parcels. This is their number they're using, they're giving to us, we're using it, it's consistent, my understanding, with how MID also does all their billings and everything, they have a GIS number that they use, so there's some consistency there. To Nick's point, if you look at OpenET, that's a field map, and that might be inset with your rows and other things.
Yes.
So this is a GIS number that the assessor recognizes as your value. It's different often than the assessor acres, because those were set like maybe back in the teens or the 20s or even before the 1900s. And they've been slowly updating with other legal basis and recalculating those numbers. So we're relying on the county stuff right now as our basis. That's what your calculation for yield would be based on.
And that number, I don't see where it shows up on my tax. Bill.
I haven't looked at anyone's tax bill, so I don't know either. I don't know if it shows.
Well, I've got a parcel with an acreage and it doesn't match.
Yeah, okay. Well, so let's see if we can further clarify that. I don't know if the intent is to change, because I think the county is slowly shifting everything to a GIS, and to get rid of the other one.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be 15%.
Is it that much?
I have some parcels that are 2.5% off and some that are like 15% off. I have one that's mostly on negative on them. I have one that's actually positive where there's more on the GIS than there is in my assessment.
Out of curiosity, I think we ran this exercise with some MID lands we saw. When you applied their fee, because people were asking, why is my fee different on each one of my parcels, my per acre fee different on my parcels? When you calculate it back by the assessor acres, it looks like the per acre cost is different, but when you divide by the GIS acres, you get to the exact same numbers. The county was using the GIS numbers and calculating your assessed tax. So as a curious exercise, maybe take a few of those, divide by that GIS acre and see if that comes out consistent on what would be your tax rate on a per acre basis. And let's understand that.
For the allocation, I always was under the impression it was gonna be our assessed acreage that shows up on the tax bill.
Well, I think that's what
they're
they're
off like 80 acres. That's significant to me.
I get it, but I think they're assessing your taxes on that GIS number. They may not be showing that in the bill. But I could be completely wrong. So can you help us investigate that?
Yeah.
And we'll mark that as something to flag and look at. Okay. Other public thoughts on section 1.4 as it relates so far? And then we can check online. I know we have chat items. I don't know if people have questions or they just asking things in chat or they just. Okay, it's in this section 1.4.
Yeah, I don't know, and I can't words here, but why are you only using one classification for acre? I mean,
And put it in the terms of, you got a wheat grower versus someone who may have invested a lot more money in trees.
So we have the definition of irrigated ag land on page 4 includes farming with several different code designations, trees and vines, several different designations, dairy with 1, poultry with 2, and non-contract. Those are all the designations we're using right now. Does that answer the question, or is there something else we're missing?
And that's gonna affect the allocation on each.
Those are, all of those things are considered irrigated, and all of those categories will get the irrigated ag allocation.
The same.
Same number for every one of those.
So basically what we're saying though is, if you're agriculture, there's one number to use throughout everything.
Correct.
It doesn't matter if you're dairy,
Correct.
trees.
Correct. Correct.
You don't think that's a detriment to those that have invested a lot more into the ground? Or is it just?
Well, I'll say this, as a board, I'll speak selfishly, yeah, I agree with your point, but with Farmer and Oxnard, there's a lawsuit going on, they tried to allocate based on historical use per APN, and it's a disaster, right? It is, you know, there's some people who did dry land beans, and there's some people who grew strawberries twice a year, and it's, yeah, it's not
The way the law's set up is your sustainable yield, no matter what you farm, what you invest in, it's off the sustainable yield the ground can hold. The ground can supply, so it doesn't, Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, but from a GSA perspective, it doesn't matter how you chose to invest in your ground, it's what the sustainable yield is, we're charged with managing that.
The other thing I would say is that Sigma and state law gives every acre of land the same access to the groundwater.
Yeah.
So that's how we got our base, I think.
And we do, we've run into this same question elsewhere, other GSAs up and down the state, where that question has come up. And somebody says, well, I just planted trees and my number is actually really low. If you consider it just planted, it's actually young orchard. So they're gonna get less and not even have enough. And then a person with a mature orchard can ripple their orchard out, plant a lower water using crop and be fully fine. And there's an equity aspect that was always recognized as problematic. And so that's why the universal is an allocation by irrigated land, regardless of your investment or growing on top of that ground. It's hard. I mean, first, I've said this to many people in this room. This is hard. This is tough. It sucks. It's a paradigm shift. There's significant, it's the largest demand reduction program in the state of California by volume. It's happening in Merced, Subbasin, GSA. That's hard. So, online, do we have comments or questions?
Yeah, so just starting at the top of the list, I'm gonna go through comments first, and then we have some raised hands. Terra Ag Ventures, how do you know what your land use designation was during the present time frame?
We should have the historic. Okay. It's in the assessed data. If it has changed since that time frame, we should know that and be able to see what it's assessed. So it's all tied back to the assessor data. We have the history.
Okay, and also, I believe if you opt in regardless of initial designation, you should have the ability to move that AMA or use a well on that AMA to irrigate another parcel, or use a well on another AMA parcel to irrigate. Also, you have to get in the water. Sarah, I think you wanted to unmute yourself and maybe elaborate on what section you're referring to during this comment.
Sure, my comment was just pertaining to the discussion around grazing land. You know, there's the restriction, I know there's a lot of caveats to the grazing land issue, but my point was merely that if you are opting in, then, you know, I for one would be, I want maximum flexibility so that if you do want to use water from that parcel on another parcel or a well, that allowing for that would be better because you're already giving up the APA by doing the opt-in. So once you, and paying any back owed taxes, but once you do that, I don't think there should be a separate designation or classification, especially if those parcels were all purchased or put into you know, irrigation within the timeline.
So if they're irrigated within the timeline, they're gonna get the full allocation. I think that the challenge of opt-in, one thing to recognize, the next section we'll get into, then you guys will see it, sustainable yield is 13 inches, ATA is 11. That's been developed based on sharing of a sustainable yield of native groundwater after deducting for some other things like the federal refuges. There's a bucket of water, we divide by essentially 170,000, 165,000 irrigated acres. That results in 13 inches of sustainable yield for all those acres. If, let's just presume 100,000 more grazing land acres came in, that new division of our sustainable yield would now be, instead of 165 or 170,000 acres, it would now be 270,000 acres, sharing that, and everybody's sustainable yield go from 13 to like 8. So right now, it's being shared, presuming that there won't be a lot of lands opting in. If there's a desire to allow some of the flexibility for that comment, and that starts to manifest, there's going to be a shared reduction in everybody's sustainable yield, because it is now being shared across a broader sector of land. Even if that land, that yield is now able to move to existing irrigated lands.
Well, I understand that, but there's nothing preventing someone that opted in from irrigating that parcel. It just can't be moved to another parcel. As long as there's a well there, of course. So, you know, it can still introduce additional irrigated lands into the overall framework. So I'm just unclear on why that restriction applies, because it's not preventing someone from opting in, starting to irrigate that parcel or a portion of that parcel. It just prevents it from being used in conjunction with other parcels that are part of the overall operation.
Why is that being done? I think it's an effort, and nobody's, I mean, again, these are all gray areas on a lot of this stuff, and who knows where this might settle, but this is an effort to try and mimic, create a proxy, and Jeannie's gonna slap me probably virtually, to create a proxy for overlying groundwater rights. So your rights to use groundwater relatively with everybody else, a property that overlies the well, overlies the aquifer with the well. So if you start now shifting that water, you're really appropriating groundwater across parcels. And that creates other challenges that are less consistent with maybe a groundwater adjudication approach. So we're trying to find that common, that appropriate level, appropriate sharing, appropriate elements. So I think your comment's been heard by the board, and any board thoughts or adds. If it's about being able to further share, because if the water was going to get used on that parcel, then you might as well be able to make it available elsewhere on other parcels. I think if I summarize that correctly.
Yes, and your feedback was really helpful. I agree that we don't want to create a situation where everyone's sustainable yield goes down because too many parcels are opting in. So that's appreciated.
So the next comment is gonna be from Sean from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Sean, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to comment. I did just want to raise a concern pertaining to conservation easements with section 1.4.2.2.1.6. An owner opting in and choosing method 1 has no obligation to maintain the managed wetland habitat. For areas with an existing conservation easement, that choice could put them in direct conflict with the perpetual rights purchased by the taxpayers of the United States. I would have some concerns with that. It also could affect values for future acquisition of conservation easements if landowners opted to pursue that route. There's language within the easements regarding the obligation to maintain managed wetland habitat. So if folks were not paying close attention to the language in specific easements, that could set up a conflict between Fish and Wildlife and owners that we would want to see avoided. My general comment would be for method 2, I think this is important for many of the clubs in the East Grasslands and supportive of that. Our project leader, Chris Harper, is on the phone. If you'd like to chime in with the remaining time, hopefully he can do that.
Sean, first off, on your first comment though, from a GSA perspective, isn't it between the federal government or who has that easement and the individual landowner? That's not per se a GSA issue. We're not in charge with managing the wetland. That's the landowner that has an easement with whatever entity.
Correct.
So maybe we just change the language a little bit, say like we're not policing it, right? I think 2.1, to that first point, that's something about the managed wetlands habitat designation, because if they want to now change the designation. Yeah, they are in, and maybe we had something beyond other obligations they may have. Sean, you're absolutely right. We've recognized that is the situation. We're trying not to get it. We don't want to be policing it on your point, but we should maybe find language that kind of is a warning that you should pay attention to your easement.
But there's no privity, sorry to speak out of turn, there's no privity of contract between the GSA and the easement.
No, we cannot.
GSA can't get involved.
Nope.
So they shouldn't be, I'm not representing the GSA, but G might suggest the GSA should not be.
Maybe just remove all language altogether. That whole thing, you know, that.
Or the GSA doesn't put any obligation on the owner.
Right.
It probably still needs to be in there, or though, because someone might not have a contract.
Somebody might not have the easement.
He might have his own wetland.
Yeah, I think those would be good, reasonable approaches for our concerns.
Thank you.
On this other section.
Oh, from Fish and Wildlife. Sean, were you still gonna have additional comment for Chris?
Well, only if Chris has additional comment.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And just Chris Harper from the Refuge here on the phone, but thanks, Sean, for raising that. I don't have anything additional.
Okay, thank you guys.
So we're gonna keep going through the comments in order received. So the next one is a comment from Spencer. It says, I think it's unfair for rangeland owners to opt in and pay the same fees as irrigated lands and not receive the same allocation, which is the additional pumping allowance as other landowners in the GSA. I understand the theory of preventing a run on people buying up rangelands to water bank, but you have effectively crippled a rangeland owner from being able to utilize their property to the highest and best use with restrictions on transfer between parcels and not receiving additional pumping allowance or allocation.
Well, first, just reiterate, the additional pumping allocation is intended to be an allowed continued overdraft to help transition land from overpumping to sustainability. So the GSA is not going to be in a position to say, let's bring on new land and let's allow it to overpump also. That's inconsistent with the intent of us trying to address signal. So that's why the ATA is not available to non-irrigated lands.
Can we let Jeannie opine on that as well? If she has something. Sure.
No, I mean, I just echo what Greg said. It wouldn't be prudent to allow people who have not historically pumped to pump more than sustainable. Anyone who is going to begin pumping now that Sigma is in place needs to pump sustainably, which is what the sustainable yield would allow. We are only giving an APA to allow people who have historically pumped to come into line with the sustainable yield, which is why it's temporary. So yeah, and Greg's exactly right.
Then we want to Ellen.
Hello, can you hear me from above?
Yep, from above.
Thanks very much. Ellen Weir with some of the East Grassland easement owners. My first question is whether you'd accept some written comments, maybe making some small suggestions for the language. We would love to provide those, and we assume the sooner the better. Relating to my next questions.
Yes. Written
Okay.
comment will be submitted and will be provided for the next board meeting.
Okay, great. I have two questions. One is why non-contract duck clubs are excluded from the definition of managed wetlands. So you've listed some zoning codes of what is defined as a managed wetland, and that it could include a grazing land use or a couple of other land uses. I'm not sure what they are because they're not defined. But then the duck clubs, the non-contract duck clubs are listed as irrigated ag. And I just want to be clear that if, you know, those duck clubs are managed wetlands. So if they want to opt in to a managed wetland allocation, we just want some clarification that they can do that.
I want to make sure we're understanding the question, Ellen. Currently the non-contract duck club code 4242 by the assessor is considered equivalent to irrigated ag and receives the entire sustainable yield of native groundwater and APA as if it was fully irrigated agriculture.
Yeah, so if those are in fact managed wetlands, which they are, they would be able to choose to opt into the managed wetland water allocation as an option, even though.
Oh, I see your question. So I'm sorry to cut you off, Ellen, but I'm understanding then that, for instance, if a parcel that's recognized as irrigated land, but only is managing a wetland and it's using 3 feet. If they were designated as managed wetland, they could opt in under method 2 and acquire 3 feet for their footprint if they can prove that.
Yes.
As irrigated, they can't get there. They don't have that option.
Yeah, we just want the managed wetland easements to be treated the same. You know, it just seems more reasonable to treat the same land uses similarly under the plan. So we just maybe will provide some feedback on those definitions to make that clearer. Unless there's some reason why those 9 parcels that have that weird zoning code wouldn't be treated the same as other managed wetlands.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. And then, sorry to take too much time. My only other question is, there's been a lot of talking about pumping on other parcels, and I want some clarification if possible. There's nothing in the current draft that I saw that requires the APA that is granted to a parcel come from groundwater that is pumped from a well on that parcel. And so, you know, in my experience, there's lots of wells that are on the boundary of 2 parcels and they share the well, the use of the well or something. You know, if you're gonna trade away your consumptive use, your APA to another parcel, that's one thing. You know, you'd have to fallow your land and trade that consumptive use to another land. But if you have a well, if 2 landowners are using the same well, they both have an APA, as long as you stay within your APA, you should be fine. Is that correct?
I would, first off, I think in general, what you're asking, I would say yes, and this really comes down to the allocation management account is registered on the Groundwater Accounting platform. That if those 2 parcels have separate accounts and they're managed separately, as long as if they're both within their allocations, if we're looking at it from a PSA standpoint, the source of the water coming from one parcel and feeding the other, we're indifferent to. But if one of those is in violation, let's say, or they are in combined violation, exceeding those numbers, we're going to start to ask questions and somebody's going to be on the hook for potential penalties. So,
Perfect. Thank you, Greg.
I think I answered it. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for showing up. Yeah. Let's move on to section
Try like.
1.5. I know there's a lot here. I appreciate everyone's patience in walking through this stuff. There's a lot to consider. This is not the only chance to get input, but this is an important dialogue to have back with groundwater allocation types and amounts. This section talks about sustainable yield of native groundwater and the additional pumping allowance as those are set up in the prior section as to who gets under what circumstances. A couple of key things to recognize here is that sustainable yield is being provided for each zone with a number. Right now, all those numbers are consistent because that's where we're starting off. We lack data to be able to go in any further designation where those numbers might vary. But this policy is set up to allow those zones to be varied by, those sustainable yield values to be varied by zone into the future. So draw attention to 1514. The GSA will reevaluate this value for each zone periodically as data and circumstances warrant, but at least in conjunction with each 5-year update of the GSP. Further adjustments may result in increases or decreases in the unit factor being available to each zone to reflect the effect of local circumstances on the GSP objective. It's intended to be continuously available at the designated value for each zone indefinitely. So this is intended to be a long-term sustainable value on a long-term average number, but right now it's the same across our whole very spatially diverse system. But it may start to modify in down the future where somebody might have higher numbers, somebody may have lower numbers. Sorry, within the zone. And everybody within that zone is treated that way. APA is set up similarly. Starts off, everybody has 11 inches. The intent is we'll go from 11 inches to 0 by the starting in 2027. So again, it starts in 2026, and then each year you will go to 0, such that you'll be at 2036. You'll have 0 APA, and you will have just your sustainable yield of native groundwater number, which again may vary by that point in time. There are some caveats. There is the opportunity for that annual decline to pause, then to be resumed, or potentially even be recovered under the methodologies that are discussed on page 13. Those all relate to this, the GSP's defined minimum thresholds and management objectives. Our GSP said our intent is to get back at a minimum to 2015 groundwater levels, as an objective to manage around 2011 groundwater levels. Some places in this GSA, there's not much difference between 2011 and 2015 values. And those values the current value is pretty close or even above 2015. It's the case out in parts in a lot of zone 8, or all of zone 8, probably. In other parts and other zones, we're significantly below 2015, and there needs to be a fair amount of increase in groundwater elevations to get to the 2015 level. That 2015 level is defined and tracked as written up in the GSP by representative monitoring wells, which are designated. And as we say, and we put the page and how we're going to be determining some of those things of whether you have a pause, whether you have a reversal, or whether you have a continuation. We're going to be looking at the groundwater conditions in each zone as an average. So I'm going to look on page 14 under 1528, middle of the page. Groundwater levels are the key. Sustainability or subsidence is also going to play in. So you may have increasing levels, but if you have added or continuing subsidence, that might trump some of any consideration of a pause or resumption. The groundwater levels will be determined as an arithmetic average of measured fall groundwater levels at the representative wells located within the zone, as long as there are enough within that zone. If there aren't enough within the zone, we are intending to, as the GSA, create a monitoring network that we believe will be representative for each of those zones. And so when you do that arithmetic average of the groundwater level, it's representative of the entire zone, has enough data pulled into that. One thought right now that's missing on this that we are contemplating is to add that at the very bottom of 15281. That last sentence, sustainable, I'll start with interpolated fall groundwater level data from a monitoring network approved for such purposes by the GSA, to add a date to that, where that GSA would approve that monitoring network by April 2025 or something, what gives us time to make sure we're picking the right wells, setting numbers and all of that, and have a process to approve that. Right now, there's no timestamp, and kind of similar to the appeal question, that isn't determined until after we've launched. People are gonna be a little concerned, so we've talked about putting a time date on there that somewhere, it gives us some time to make sure we get it. That could be helpful. You can see other determinations
Okay.
there on these limitations and limitations.
Can you explain that time date a little more?
So Gino, for instance, we know there's been a significant amount of data submitted on local groundwater conditions, local data. They are not part of an official monitoring network necessarily. And there's some lack of clarity as to what exactly the full monitoring network is. And so as an example, we need to add some more wells, but we don't know which wells necessarily we're gonna include. And we need to say it's this well, and that well. Some of those might not have a 2015 date. So we may have to use other wells to create a proxy that we all agree on and say, yes, this looks good. So we just need a little bit of time to get that taken care of. We could maybe make it November or December, or we could make it April just to give us some room, but I don't think we'd want to go much further or much past that. As a thought, does that help, Peter?
Yeah.
Then there's a few limitations discussed under 153, the end of this section. One is the consumptive use on any parcel per acre average would be maximum. Again, this is all consumptive use. This is not pumped. You might be super inefficient and pump more. Your consumptive use would be limited to a maximum of 48 inches on average across your entire parcel. For a particular year, for everything, all the parcels within your AMA. So you might have an account that's got 10 parcels. Some you might barely have any consumption going on. They might be dry farmed, might be fallow, they might be low water. Some might have a higher number. We're going to talk about the average across everything that's in your account.
Greg, on that question, on the platform. Oh, I know OpenET does not back out the rainfall of consumptive use of rainfall, right? Do they do that on the platform? Or, because I know a lot of my fields are over 48 inches, right? It's just because it rains a lot, it's not because I use a lot of water, and
Yeah.
to be clear.
My
Just 48 inches.
Not yet, but I'm going to draw your attention. The intent would be, we do need to address that. There's still some open questions as whether we have one number that uses every year, whether we have one number that uses by some sort of classification on maybe the San Joaquin River precipitation index, or whether we look at a monthly value and make some determination of what's considered effective.
But Greg, as a GSA or as a statement of the board, we are leaning towards having some number.
We absolutely will have some number that will be deducted from the ET, the total consumption, will subtract effective precip. And then your consumption that will be measured against your allocation available will be recognized there. On page 20, there is a section to be drafted 1.8.3 accounting for effective precipitation. So we have just not gotten there, but that will be addressed. The platform currently does have an effective precip. There is a method that OpenET uses. So you can see a number reflected there. It just may not be what we ultimately adopt as our policy.
Is that part of the color of the polygon in OpenET? Like when it says 56 inches in OpenET, that's just total.
That's total. So
That's total, yeah.
So again, the groundwater accounting platform uses OpenET, but then does some math, and it does subtract effective precip right now as a number, but it's not a policy we have adopted. If you're over at OpenET, which is etdata.org, I think that's the web address. What they show is just raw total consumption, regardless of the source of the water, which part of it is rainfall, and we know things like, a great example, 2023, tons of rain. There were fields that showed high total ET. There was no irrigation going on those fields. We got to make sure we're capturing those things and not creating an issue. And Or maybe we need to appeal that part too, maybe it was a high rain event appeal. Let me hit the 1.5 on the TAC first. And then let's go public.
I think you also need to try to get the 1.6 and 1.7 too.
So maybe relate, okay, if there's anything on 1.5 from the TAC right now, then maybe some input from public on 1.5. Okay, let's go public, we got Q.
As soon as you're with public.
Yeah, we'll go Q, public.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment along with the main falls of fog is significant in my part of the world. When I look at open ET, on fields that I know I have not irrigated a wheat crop, the ET is higher than the rainfall there. And I know the roots aren't going to the water table either.
We sow wheat crops, man, they go deep.
No. So there is, fog is significant, and we have to look at all the factors.
I think maybe we should look at trying to find a way to prove that someone didn't irrigate a parcel. And then it doesn't matter what the fog and what the rain is, it's if there's a way that the GSA can determine that this was not irrigated, period, end of story, we don't care what the numbers are, right? Does that make sense? It might be a simpler way to address.
Well, but there are gonna be parcels that are irrigated and then receive fog and rainfalls.
Agreed, but if you're, you know, we could mitigate a lot of issues if it's like, hey, we know you didn't irrigate via this method, we know that. We could eliminate some staff appeals maybe.
Yeah, I agree with his comment down there. Is I had some open fields that on open ET says it was 22 inches of water. Probably rainfall, and that wasn't right, obviously. Second, it was disc. Yep. Disc dirt. So my second question is there an appeal process to this in the form of, and that goes back to the 1.5 is open ET says you use this. I have moisture probes, flow meters that say otherwise. Is there an appeal process where I can come back and say, you said I used 1 acre foot, example, but in reality, we used 0.75.
The intent is that we will defer to a remote sensing source, but that if desired and through some documentation, another data source is what will be representative. Like you want to use meter. Platform is going to allow that functionality. How we bring that in yet is to be determined. But if you, for your parcel, say, I don't try, and maybe it goes to the situations like when you're out, you got weird things like fog. Well, fog's not weird, but events that are affecting the consumption that seem anomalies, and you want to use a meter, we agree that that parcel is going to be monitored by a meter, and you represented, you give us certification that it's all installed and it's calibrated, and we have some representation of your efficiency of that operation. And we use that as the data source to determine consumption. That is a pathway that's allowed through the groundwater accounting platform right now. It's not, obviously it's not turned on. We don't have that. The intent is in the monitoring, there is the potential for using other sources of data for that purpose.
Just using the meter might be hard because that 1 meter may irrigate 5 different fields.
Hopefully all those are in one account. We just care about the entirety. We're not caring field by field, so you want to put all those parcels in one bucket.
Yes, yeah, which they are.
And you might have 5 wells that serve all those parcels.
But if you're gonna want to dispute one individual.
That's what I mean. If we're gonna dispute one individual parcel on open ET, that's gonna become a challenge because you're gonna say, yeah, it's certified, prove that it went there. Well,
Right, so I think there's a question about an appeals process on the quantity. We'll make sure that there is something listed there. It may be, I know circumstances down the valley, others might be familiar. They were using Land IQ, I think it's the source, semi-tropic storage district was doing this, and somebody challenged it, and they used another firm's methodology of remote sensing, and they figured it out.
do, because none of this stuff is absolute. You have meters aren't absolutely probes that'll, weather station will tell you if there's fog. Right, and so there's ways to address the issues, but these are edge issues. That we're gonna have to recognize there's a process to deal with them. Edge issues that could turn into. For individuals, they could turn into really big things for individuals, but they're very important for you, but they may not affect 99 other people, right? So that's what I mean by an edge issue. It's not to dismiss that, it's to make sure we capture it, but maybe it's just an appeal process rather than trying to create rules that are just. And then it can be brought to staff, one off, maybe to the board, discussed, resolved, and move on. And I realize there's gonna be issues that come up in the future, I'm just trying to see, 5 years down the road. Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate your guys' position. So we'll make note of that, something associated with all the healing of the quantities and stuff.
One thing just to keep in mind, hopefully to give you some comfort, is that all the board members are farmers. Our idea is to be accurate, and if you've got data that contradicts something, it'll.
Jeff, you had something you wanted to raise here? Oh, sorry. I may say one thing. I mean, I just hope between that concern, Ben, I would hope that the data presented isn't really far off, right? I'm sure we're gonna be arguing over inches, maybe 6 at best, right? But if someone's gonna say they use 2 feet less than what it's saying, well, that's a different thing, right? So. I know the meters have their own set of problems, right? And I have lots of them, and the batteries die, and the mag meters, they don't read, or symmetrics. Yes. Everyone buys symmetrics that won't read, and then you'll use no water. ID. I'm thinking along the lines of Whisper probes, right? You can see that irrigation. Yeah. So I know we're sick of time, we gotta keep going. So one interjection on that before I ask Jeff to speak up. Again, the allocation is being set up and you don't see it until the monitoring section. You may need to make it clear somewhere else. You start off with a 5-year bucket. Some of these things that might be issues that work against you in 1 year are gonna work for you the next year. And so it might average out over time based on a variety of things. I'm not saying that's the case, but that just, you're trying to give room for managing the averages. You have a year to an appeal process, you're not, well, we have that too, but you might get fog doing something this year, and then next year you have no fog, and the ET underestimated what may have happened, and that worked to your advantage. So. Jeff.
Yeah, I think it's correct, but I didn't see it explicitly. The allocation at 13 inches and 11, that's ET.
That is consumptive use of applied water. Yes, measured by remote sensing or other pathways like metering will be allowed at some point once we define that. Any questions online on this section?
So we have a comment from Tara Act, but it might be referring to a previous comment. It says to further add to this comment, the economics should dictate what is allowed. If someone is buying up rangeland to the water bank, they have to pay for the rangeland, then opt in and pay back taxes. If someone wants to do that just to the land of bank water. And by the way, the rangeland is likely to be in the areas where wells need to be drilled pretty deep, otherwise it would already be in a higher and better use crop. Then more power to them, that's now.
Yeah, good comment. Any answer to this right now? Okay.
Greg, before you go on the next one, on the annual APA decline.
Yes.
Beginning 2027. No, we're usually not gonna decline or change anything, so it's been a 2-year consecutive. I mean, you're beginning in 2027, but we started in 2026.
So with regard to that, one other concept is
1.5.2.3.
Yeah.
4.
The opportunity under, I'm gonna look on page 14. Or is it actually in front of that?
I was looking at
it. Shows up in a couple places, right? So on page 13, 15251 says
because the first place it says the pause in groundwater decline will remain, so groundwater levels in the sustainability zone. Sorry, pause will and the decline will occur if all the following occur. Groundwater levels in the sustainability zone remain at or above fall 2015 levels for a period of 2 consecutive years. Your point is, when is that
Starting when?
When is that start date? There's a consideration, we should add a start date of either 24, 25, 26,
Yeah.
2018, 20, I mean, there's a discussion to be had there. Does that question make sense to the board? And
At least it should start in 2026. Which is our first active year. But if you're in that 2015 level previously to that, why wouldn't it start sooner?
Right, so the idea is, if you are already at the 2015 levels and you're starting this, you shouldn't get a decline into that next 27 year. There shouldn't be any decline because you're gonna get.
Right.
So, but you can't measure that 2 years because you haven't had 2 years.
Right.
So it's a question of setting up the right starting point. So let's consider a date to put in there.
Yeah.
That makes sense to the board? You know? Kind of, no,
Are you talking about 1.5, 15253?
15251.
251, okay.
Where it says all levels 20, the period of 2 years above, at or above 2015 levels.
Okay, so we start, since it starts in 2026, we put in 2024, 2025.
Or 25,
So you got
26.
2 years
So 25, 20, yeah, 2 years,
Just
so
2
you
years
start,
before the
yeah, let's start.
2027, so you don't
wouldn't-
take away and turn around and have to give it right back to you. Like take it away.
That's the
Yeah.
consideration of the date there.
To be fair, I think, doesn't the VSP say, the 2015 is the minimum threshold, but the measurable objective is 2012?
2011. So this is just the pause. You don't get to actually come back up or gain anything. In the case if you never started, then you regain. You don't gain unless you're at 2011.
The only advantage you're gonna carry your bucket over, your carryover for that 5 year.
Any other comments or thoughts or
The 1.5.3.2, or sorry, are we done with all the public?
yeah,
Okay, so, and I know we reworded it, but the 5 year,
where are you?
the subsidence, page 15, 1.5.3.2.
Okay.
So that will not, because you don't have, the way it's looking right now, they would go to 0 right off the bat. That's not gonna start till 2030, right? Being able to take that away, the way that's
Correct.
worded.
Correct.
I just want to make sure we're on the same page and then do a rolling 5 year average.
Correct. Or I continue, yeah.
Then each year it'd be based off the last 5 year average, whether they got an APA or not for
Yes.
the subsidence area.
Yes.
Or not area, but any zone facing subsidence.
All right, 1.6 is a very short section. It's just defining the sustainability zones. And it represents the map that's available on the GSA's website. As noted in 1.62, the GSA may reevaluate sustainability zone boundaries as data and circumstances warrant. We're trying, if you remember, the principles, the governing principles were about certainty and fairness and consistency and simplicity. So all these things kind of work against each other to some point, but the intent is to not make a lot of changes, but we still may need to make some changes. So we're leaving room for some change. It's not intended to be drastic, dramatic. Oh, hold it, I was planning on this and now you just pulled the rug out or something. So these are all just spaces to make adjustments. Moving to 1.7, allocation management accounts. This is where it becomes really important. Because the allocation management account is what you're going to establish through the groundwater accounting platform. That allows you to, at your discretion, link all the parcels together that you're farming and operating within a sustainability zone. You cannot link and have an account that crosses that has parcels in 2 different zones. One account per zone. That account could have 1 parcel, could have 20 parcels. Trying to give you as much flexibility, and those do not have to be contiguous parcels. So it's gonna be scattered around however you might be farming. You're going to create your allocation account through the groundwater management accounting platform. We have a lot of people who have started that. We have a lot that have yet to log in, I think still, right? So we have more education and outreach that's going to continue, and I would implore everybody here to continue to ask people when you're talking to them, did you go in and start your account yet? If not, they can contact the county or the GSA, and we can assist them through that process.
As of last night, there was 118 accounts made out of the 900 something letters that we sent out, but some of those accounts might have had one stolen.
Right, so
It's
Cal, you might have got 3 letters to one address because you were, as John likes to say, you were Greg Young LLC and then Greg Young L space L plus space C, and those are seen as 2 different addresses, and you get 2 separate pins. Those might have been combined. So those 100 or so might represent maybe 20% sign up so far. We'll look at how some of those might have been combined. What now is in 172, 173, and 174 deal with, since you have an account and it's got a bucket defined for water in it. You now have the situation that in farming, you lease parcels to others, or you're leasing others parcels, or you're selling parcels. The way we're setting these up is this represents how you need to inform the GSA that I'm going to lease some of my land to Lloyd, a parcel, and with that, a certain amount of water is going to go with that. So then in the accounting platform, the accounting platform can see that parcel is now over in Lloyd's account and with a certain quantity of water added to his, and it's subtracted from mine for purposes of monitoring. So that's what this allocation leasing does. Same with the sales. You'll note that it's your choice. I may choose to not move any water with the land I lease. I want to keep the water, but I'm gonna lease it and they're gonna dry land farm it. Might be a 20-year lease. So they're gonna put solar or some kind of, it's like, we just need to know how much water and what land. We don't need to know anything else about the details of it. We don't need to know pricing. We don't need to know anything else. We just need to be able to know to move the water. Same thing for sales. I can sell it with or without water if I want. That just has to be disclosed to us and we can modify the accounts appropriately.
To speak to that, Greg, 1.7.2.3.1, minimum of a 1-year term. I think the GSA is gonna have a.
Bottom of page 16.
Yeah, bottom of page 16. I don't know if the GSA has the right to tell people that they can't lease their land for less than 1 year. I know people in our area will lease it out to sweet potatoes for 3 to 4 months and then they'll take care of it the rest of the year. And I don't know what position we want to take on that, but I also think that we're overcomplicating it by having the GSA track all these leases and deal with all this administration trouble. Every other utility I know, our local water district, they deal with the landowner. That's it. If the landowner is not responsible in tracking their own stuff, the lien gets put against their property. It's their problem anyways. So are we overcomplicating something that we don't need to be doing? That's kind of a concern I have.
My opinion would be, then don't tell us. The only reason we want to know is if you are gonna be in a situation where we assess and we're like, hey, you're over. Like you used too much in your account. You're like, well, I didn't farm that parcel. I gave it to so-and-so, so it should be judged against them. Well, as long as that's not our GSA issue, care less. If you have that covered in some way, fine. But if that becomes our issue, we're gonna make it your issue.
Okay, so maybe we could introduce that into the writing a little bit more. Of saying, hey, you don't have to tell the GSA, but if you want to, cover COA, cover your own hands.
It's kind of based off, and most people that have been MID have done it this way for years. It's based off how MID does it.
Yeah.
If you're renting ground, you have a landowner tenant agreement that goes to the leasee's account, but the landowner goes about it that way. No funny business is going on where the leasee could take the water, the landowner doesn't even know about it. So probably need something in there for that, because guys might start doing funny business and then they're getting mad at GSA, but we have nothing to do with it. So
is there gonna be a penalty if you don't comply and do this leasing?
I don't think so.
No,
But
you do it at your own risk.
Yeah.
If your leasee takes all your water, you might come to GSA, I got this much to pump, and we say, no.
Yeah,
Right,
here's your fine.
You're over it, yeah.
Your
that's your
account's
own
at
risk.
zero, bro.
Yeah. If your tenant took all if your tenant took all your water and you didn't report it to us, then you wanted it this way.
But if your tenant still took all your water, what's it matter?
But
The GSA is gonna go after that property and put the lease right back on, the lien is gonna go under the landowner.
Not necessarily, because if the lease has it over into the other account, we're gonna manage to that account, and we're gonna go to that account owner as the operator.
But if someone just moves out of the state and says, well, I burned all my bridges, I'm out, you know, I mean.
You're right, at the end of the day, it's back on the landowner.
So.
So that's no different from utilities or MIT costs
That's
or
my point.
whatever. It'll
It's
fall
just
right
like,
back to landowner.
it's just like every other utility is done like that.
I get the
So-
point, whether, I think we need it in here, whether we put any other caveat language, I'll.
Yeah, I mean, we need it, I mean, I rent a lot of land, I mean, yeah, you need something in there to where I can get the bills and go in my account or whatever the thing is. The whole 1 year thing, is that because it's hard, say I rent it for a certain term, how much water did I, like, to slice that pie, right? It just makes it a little bit work, right?
Right, and the allocation, essentially, you're getting added to your account on an annual basis, and we're doing the assessment and monitoring on an annual basis. So if you start subdividing and saying, well, at least to this person, and then at least to that person, and then it's a tracking nightmare. So I would rather, I would suggest, if you're just doing a 3-month lease, you don't even tell us, that's water got used on that account for that period of time. So that's why the minimum of a year was put there for our administrative burden. Limited.
Well, just that you won't, because it can say that you can reject them. If you can reject something, because a lot of these, ones will be reviewed by the technical and whatever, and there's staff review submitted information related to find objectives, stuff like that. If you're having staff review that lease, and if it isn't a minimum of a year, are you gonna throw some kink in the guy? Like I say, if you just don't report it.
Well, I think as it's written right now, you just don't report it. Because this is just setting up rules to make it easier for the GSA.
Well,
If you
there's no
don't report it-
penalties, there's no penalties or anything for
Well,
not
this-
reporting.
Yeah, there should be, because right now there's a limitation for a term.
Yeah.
Less than a year, and maybe it should say something along the lines of, the GSA will only take responsibility for leases that are a year or more.
It doesn't sound like a good policy to set up a policy where you're saying, just don't tell us, so we don't enforce.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna say, don't.
I don't wanna say that.
It's not an policy, but.
Our policy is don't tell us.
I mean, that's.
It's recorded, I said.
If the GSA wants annual accounting, I mean, even year-long leases start at different months, so is it all gonna be calendar year accounting or?
So in kind of in conjunction with Bob, I was thinking the same thing. You lease your land out for sweet potatoes for a portion of a year and they use all the water. Now the landowner comes back with another lease for a winter wheat crop. And they plan on irrigating, but yet all the allocation for that land is gone. You kind of somehow, there's got to be some sort of communication and accountability.
Because if you turn in the lease, we're gonna take it. That water, in theory, while it was written, if you turn in the lease, that water will be transferred from the landowner's AMA to the leasee's AMA.
Right.
So that way they have it part of their deal. That's if people that, like Nick used an example, you're leasing ground year after year, you want that in your bucket. As long as the landowner agrees, the sweet potato deal is kind of not a one-off, but if it's just a short-term deal, that's the landowner's risk of whether they use all your water. As long as it's just for transferring the water in your management account.
So really what we need is a landowner tenant agreement, we don't need to see leases or.
Well, that's what this kind of was.
I think that's where it came from, and
Yeah.
it kind of morphed into this, right?
So
With the agreement of how much water is gonna be available to this other farm unit.
Yeah, because you can have sweet potatoes where they want to use pumps for the groundwater, well, then the other time of the year, the ground might be using surface water. And the owner could be doing that or whatever. So it's just different sources of water that we don't care about surface
But
water.
in that case, the way the platform's supposed to be set up is your surface water will get turned down. You'll have a record of buying surface water. It will go into the platform saying you, so you'll still be fine.
So that kind of goes to the point of why are we doing all the hassle and having to create all this work? Let the landowner track it with their own tenant and.
Because as a
Yeah,
leasee,
because as a lead, oh yeah, good.
I think I'm saying, as a leasee, I want the AMA, I want that water in my account.
You're
And
paying,
the
I'm paying
GSA
rent.
needs to know
Yeah,
that.
I want them like.
I want it on my account. And if it's gonna be under my account as a leasee, the GSA needs to know that it's gonna be under my account, and there needs to be a paperwork. I can't just show up and say, hey, Greg, give me,
Yeah.
your AMA, your water, like, there needs to be an agreement.
Instead of what, one more comment while we're all doing it, I guess. Instead of kind of the don't ask, don't tell policy for a year, I think with just a little bit of tweaks to the language, you guys could say that the GSA is only assuming responsibility for leases that exceed. But it's not making somebody in violation irrespective of the fact that there's no penalty, but then you're not in violation if you lease a sweep to. You could say, look, the GSA is not gonna get involved unless this lease is a year or more.
But they're gonna have to get involved a little bit to the point, right? If I wanna rent for a year, some of your property.
No, if the GSA will get involved if it's a year or more, but if it, for the 3 months, the
Nick might have hit it even better than everybody on this right now. If we just had a landowner tenant agreement for the water, not per se, say lease. Because a lease is everybody thinking of my right to lease the ground. A form, an agreement that would transfer in.
Transfer the water.
Transfer the
Really,
water.
transfer the water.
If we look at 17213,
17213.
page 16, about 1/3 of the way down. The GSA staff reviews the submitted information. We have not defined what that is. That can easily be defined, just these limitations of just this simplistic stuff with something else on there that illustrates these points, and we're only going to review and deny or approve or condition associated with this rule. That's what it states there. So it's.
See,
That's all we're limiting ourselves to, is if it's related to this rule, we might condition, oh, you don't have any water in your bucket. You can't actually lease 20 units of water because you only have 15 or something like that. So that's what we're trying to do. The terminology here and in sale is undefined as the form, but it's intended to be a fairly simple tenant, what do you call it? Landowner.
water transfer agreements.
Landowner tenant agreement, right. I mean, you separately have a transfer agreement, a transfer provision in one.
Essentially, that's all the GSA cares about. Where's the water? I don't care your agreement, parameter, and your it's true.
It's too much. Stay out of like that, it's more or less than a year.
Again, when you're looking at monitoring here, you go through the accounting platform, your account is gonna have 7 parcels in it. And if one of those parcels or 2 of those, if somebody else is managing or operating it, those parcels we want for monitoring, we wanna see them in their other account, so we can check that account.
But
So that's why the sale or lease should say what parcel and what water went with those parcels.
But that's all we need. We don't need a time frame, because even if it's 3 months, you're taking X amount of water. You're gonna have an agreement that says, for the sweet potato guy, just using that example, I'm taking 6 inches out of, your account going into my account. So do we really need a time frame on it, or just that,
Yes,
for that irrigation, for that water year,
But you would need a quantity of water and a physical location.
Yes.
Of where you.
But if you just did it for 3 months and then gave it back, now when I'm monitoring at the end of the year. Well, now I have to go and go like, hold on, well, 3 months was over in this one, and 9 months was over here.
But that will be in the agreement, so we know already as a GSA, that land say has a 13 just sustainable year, that land has 13 inches. Well, you're gonna,
Yeah, but now we have-
but you're taking 6 inches out of that 13 over to this account, and it'll be a little more paperwork for the GSA, but
It's gonna be a lot more paperwork.
Well, that's what I'm getting at.
And it doesn't
I'm trying to keep
function.
down costs on that. Can we look at
Hold on a
the
second.
water county platform?
Let him finish and then I'll.
It doesn't function in the tracking, because the tracking is how much water is used on these parcels in this account against time, right? There's graphs that are in that accounting platform, but now there's a carve out that was really over here, so it's gonna misrepresent what's showing up for the entire year. It's easiest for us to say nothing, a year, at least a year or more, that's all we care about. Tell us that on an annual basis, you're gonna give us that information once a year. If you don't wanna tell us,
Craig kind of had a good idea, maybe, is that, we're gonna have a sheet that maybe a form that somebody could tell us, hey, I'm leasing these parcels to this person, I'm transferring X out of my AMA to them. And, so it's not their lease, it's not all the rest of it.
Exactly.
But it's just the agreement on the water. That's what we're interested in.
Exactly.
And then somehow we need to roll it on water year. Right, if we're gonna have some sort of basis.
The problem is we're calendar year.
We're running calendar year as our whole basis. So we have.
It'll have to be counted.
No, yeah, but it's gotta be an annual basis.
I guess what water are you talking? You're talking about rainfall water here, or are you talking about
Can't be
irrigation water here?
I'm talking about, yeah.
Oh,
So I wanna, in the interest of time, it's already or on this, we got
Makes sense.
sale and lease is very similar. Yes, we only care about what parcel and how much water.
Great, last one, you go to 17211. Pretty much just says what Lloyd said, and then last line says a copy of the lease does not have to be provided.
17211. Right, the copy of the lease does not need to be provided, right? So we don't have a form yet, what it looks like, and I think some of us are reacting to the term lease, and it sounds like we're getting the whole lease. We don't need to see that. The same plays over to 174, transferring allocations between AMAs. In a sustainability zone, you can sell water allocation, which is an allowance to pump a quantity of water. You can sell it to somebody else. I can sell some to Brad from my water, Brad, but no parcels moved. It's the quantity of water. That's gonna be allowed. Huh?
No particles.
No parcel moves. I'm not giving you a parcel of land, but with
Oh.
I count
And
water against.
No particles,
No.
neither.
Yeah, okay. No, the particle didn't. The particle of groundwater is
Just
being pumped.
underground.
It's still not moving, it's just being pumped by somebody else within a hydrogeologic region that we think is close enough to be homogeneous.
Yeah.
So you're allowed to transfer water to somebody else that's not in your account without moving land with water. Maybe a reason for you to do that, maybe you took some ground out, you're resting it for several years before you decide to take your next step. And somebody's growing wall-to-wall nuts and they need a little bit more because they're running out in their bucket. And they need to buy some water to stay through the next year or two, and they're gonna just buy some water from your allocation, but they're not buying land, they wanna buy some water. We don't care about any of the price, we don't need to see any of that, we just need to know how much is coming out of your bucket and whose bucket is it going into. So that's what 174 allows. There is no transfer allowed across sustainability zones with one caveat. If you happen to own a parcel or farm across that zone, and they're contiguous parcels, so you just happen to be subdivided by the boundary, which is a little arbitrary, that you can transfer to yourself. Essentially across the account, because you have to have a unique account in each sustainability zone. So if I'm in this zone and I'm in this zone and the parcels are really next to each other, I can transfer to myself. But you can't transfer to other parties across that zone. That's what it's written right now.
That'll likely take staff intervention to make happen in the back end. You won't be able to do that on the website most likely, I would assume.
You're right, you have to submit information, we have to
Just
approve
so
it now.
So everybody knows.
Yeah, the premise of all this is to try and manage groundwater levels and subsidence within these zones, so we see the improvements we need to see. So we kind of are indifferent to where the water gets pumped within that zone. That's why you can have your account, have multiple parcels that don't have to be contiguous. That's why you could maybe transfer water to neighbor. No, really, the GSA doesn't care. They just want to see groundwater levels come up in that area. We know there's time delays and lags on any long-term movement of water underground. So you can't sell water from here way over to another zone, because the reality is that water is not moving. It's not fast.
Yeah, I need to take up things. I have an all-star baseball game, and I gotta be there at 5, strict rules for Little League, so. Thank you very much for coming. Is there an appetite to have another one of these before it gets adopted? I mean, I think this is this is a really, really big deal, and I hate, just try to jam it through, I mean. I don't know what
pages.
Yeah, I don't know what changes we're gonna ask Greg to do. I know we talked about the appeals process, and that seems to be pretty important, right, to get some language, something down. You know, in a vague or detailed it can be, but thank you for coming, and I guess think we need to have another one. I think we'll get one on the board before that.
We can get one scheduled in July.
Yeah.
So I think that's later part of July.
Yeah.
Later part of July.
They don't let
I
you
don't, if people can stay, I want to keep chatting.
Yeah, I know, and I did, on this subject of transferring between, allocation management accounts, you're just talking about what is the combined water account and the groundwater accounting platform, and that's the sustainable yield. There's nothing in here that talks about other sources of water. Recharge water or other percolation of surface water.
Right.
That's not in here, but it should be in here to be able to transfer. You should be able to also move that just as well as your allocating.
So, right now, we are not saying you can't. There is no rule that GSA has about if you have, let's just take surface water. If you wanted to transfer your surface water to another, some other part of this, of the GSA, what's our role in approving that? We don't really have a rule, we don't have a policy, but we aren't not allowing it. This is really focused only on the groundwater allocation and your movement and use of that.
But recharge water is in the ground and it's only groundwater.
The recharge water is going to be, we need the policy that recognizes account, credits an account from recharge. That recharge will be used by you to meet consumptive use or transfer to somebody else. That is not here, but it will be in the accounting platform. It's not in this policy, because this policy is about groundwater allocation. Recharge is stored surface water in the way we want to look at it. This is our consideration here. This is native groundwater, and it's allowed over pump. Anything else is not in this policy. It's not to say that it doesn't mean it's doesn't have to come. You have to address it at some point. It probably still gives you pause, but I don't, if we start getting in here about, here's what you do if you're transferring surface water or recharge water, well, now we need to define what's recharge water. We don't have that policy, and it's not intended to be in this one. Or not in here, it's other policies we as a GSA have to.
You could amend this later if you wanted to bring something in to that effect.
This is, the GSA is setting itself up to have a long set of ordinances. One of these is this section. There's also the well permitting consistency. That's, rule that's been adopted. That has to get folded in some way. So there's a series of line, just like you go to county code, you go to this code section and there's all these details. There will be a section about recharge. There'll be a section about some other things and other topics that we get to run the ground. This is the major heavy lift. Be able to show the state that we moved from what we said, which was we're dealing with demand management, to here is what we're doing for demand management, and it is going to solve our issue. That's a huge step that we need to show the state. So the state says, you guys are looking good, we'll give you another 5 years.
I'll speak one comment back to the AMA transferring. And the TAP knows this, but only for the benefit of the board. When the board gave instructions to EKI and everybody to create the sustainability zones, one of the instructions was to keep the farm units intact. I think generally everybody did a good job of that. I might be the unlucky one where the sustainability zones as adopted, there's 3 on my contiguous property. And I've got pipelines going from one to the next to the next. They're not within a half mile from each other. So I can't transfer the water allocation for this. This goes back to I know it was not the intent of the board at the time to divide my property into 3 sustainability zones, but I'm going to try to get in front of the board hopefully soon to see if the board would reconsider that.
There is with this, there is an appeal for your case.
The appeal, there is not an appeal for my case because it exceeds 300 acres.
Yep.
So you guys drafted the appeal, because the second that came out, I jumped all over it. And then I was like, well, I can't appeal to it.
Sorry.
So hopefully I'm the only unlucky one where you guys, but again, this property is completely contiguous. And I hope to bring it in front of the board very soon.
And your point is the transfer policy still doesn't solve the issue of the subdivided.
That's exactly my point. Moving it from one zone to another within a half a mile. And I don't know how the board would even account for the AMA, because you've got wells in one, wells in the other, pipelines going everywhere. I don't know how the board would do that. So, I mean, this is self-serving, but in my opinion, the board's better served by just having one.
Don't ask them to.
One account.
I'm saying that.
Let's put it on my side.
Okay, I got your answer, Greg, that's fine. 1.7.4.1.4. I don't really understand that whole section. What's the defined objective criteria of the rule? I don't see that in the document.
Okay, so to your point, it says the GSA staff reviews the submitted information in relation to the defined objective criteria in this rule.
That's
and they
confusing.
deny approve. So what is that? And do we need to add some more clarification on it?
To bring up these and stuff, going up to page 16, 1.7.2.1.2. Parties must pay a transaction fee established by the MSGSA. That's again, like for multiple times that is listed. What kind of fees is the board trying to do with that? Are we trying to just cover admin costs to do that? Are we trying to make it so that people are not wanting to do this around so much? We make it an exorbitant fee, or do we want to make it affordable?
Well, with state law, we can only charge with cost.
Okay, I didn't know if that should be more defined, but if it's state law, then that's defined.
It's like even the Prop 218, we can't charge more than what it costs to benefit. I mean, that kind of thing.
Cool. I just wasn't sure.
I'm gonna add some more context on that. Sigma defines what we can do for fines.
Okay.
The fee is actually a little more open, but it is subject to 218. The intent of these things is cover admin. If you're gonna come in and make us do more paperwork, right? You might have to submit $100 and $500. It's kind of like the well application fees. Something to cover the one-offs.
Is it worth throwing some kind of wording in there to that effect to mitigate other people having the same question? Is kind of what I was getting at with the whole.
Yeah, so I want to differentiate the other places. If you're gonna appeal and say, or you're gonna opt in, you're gonna be paying fees associated with like back fees that are much more extensive and could be much more expensive because of the phase 1 fees and everything. This is, so yeah, we can add something that maybe kind of says, hey,
Just
a
help the public-
transactional administrative fee or something.
Yeah, just to help the public know what that fee might be structured as.
That's helpful, we can do something like that. And that falls several places, so we're gonna jump to online. Okay.
So Adriel was saying the shorter term lease would be accommodated for the transfer.
Yeah, we have Adriel, he's smart.
Okay, Greg, what do you think about wrapping up at 4:30 regardless of where we are, since we're gonna come back anyways?
I think that it's your board meeting.
Good job, President. Lead it.
Yeah,
Before we
so,
leave this
there you go.
section, before we leave this section, the limitations. The first thing in your limitations has a date, 2030, I'm sure that's because we want to do the 5-year. Section 1.
Talking about page 18 on 1742 limitations. I'm on there.
Sunset, January 30th, that's for a 5-year period from the 25 renewal to another period, 5 years, is that sort of what that's designed to do?
What it's designed to do.
It looks like it's only a one-time thing.
What it's designed to do is because we could adjust your sustainable yield.
Right.
And let's just for hypotheticals, say you were at 13, but then for whatever circumstances, we actually don't have that much, it's 9 inches. But you transfer 13 and it goes for another several years, somebody's gonna say, I bought 13, it's not my problem, it's somebody else's. So we're saying, we don't wanna get into that mess, so if you sunset it at 2030, we can reassess. So I think a clarifier that we can put on maybe to, or Chino's gonna go, you could have the transfer go further, but the quantity we'll recognize is going to.
What I was gonna say, Greg, it came up at the board, was mentioned, well, if someone just wants to buy the water perpetually, like if someone wants to sell it, and then what happens, like Greg said, if we decide we need to change the sustainable yield, the data is not we decide, the data shows us we need to change it. And then that guy's like, well, I bought the sustainable yield, I bought 13 inches a year for 50 years. That's why we put a date in there.
Date makes it look like it's a one-time only transaction. I think it should be more of a renewal or a reevaluation period.
Yeah, it could be worded a little different, but that's the date originally came in, so someone just knows. You're not gonna go by 50 years worth of 13
Well, then you
inches.
could leave
You're
the
not
date
guaranteed
in.
to get
Leave the date in and then add to it for reevaluation periods.
Yeah,
So,
we can.
Yes, we can see that.
so it's ongoing,
Yeah.
doesn't seem like a one-time thing, we're gonna do this forever. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, something like that, that's great. Public comment into this section. I would kind of bounce around anyway, so.
Yeah, going back to leases, if you have multiple users or multiple tenants on one tax parcel, is there a way to split that out? Or is there a mechanism for that? No.
Not to be a brat, you're not, the map act prohibits that, so, they're not, sorry, guys. I'll let Jeannie talk about that.
You got lawyers weighing in, because I have large parcels, right, and my fields don't line up with parcels. So so there's no mechanism, if I have a tenant on one and I farm, we're both farming within the same tax parcel. Is there a method to? The current accounting in the groundwater platform has your allocation management account will be the parcel. Okay. And any other parcels, even if fields move across there, or even if different people farm within those parcels, we are at the parcel level. That's the question, yeah.
And so it was Genie is no longer.
Okay, the map act, my belief is it restricts landowners from leasing subsets of your ground unless you have a qualified exemption to that. Not, so. Anyway.
I'm gonna move to monitoring. And yes, we'll revisit a lot of this, if we schedule another one, there's also the comment period on July 11th, board meeting. Monitoring here is, the first part of this is established, we still need to add more. The first part of this is the important part, where it essentially says, under, so this is bottom of page 19, under 1812. The total available allocation in our AMA, this is your management account, beginning in 2026 will consist of total available allocation, depending on what type of land class, is either sustainable yield, NAPA, or some variance of that. Be the total for years 26, 27, 28, 29, 30 in the amounts defined in section 1.5. So there's your 5-year bucket defined right there. Beginning in 27 and every year thereafter, the AMA will be updated as follows. There'll be a decrease associated with consumption or an adjustment associated with consumption. You may have had a fallow land, there's no change. And an add of the following out year, it's now added to your bucket. So in 2027, let's say you were farming, your 2027 is going to be adjusted for whatever the consumptive use was in 26. And let's for a moment say there's nothing other than groundwater. Other sources of water will help with that. You only use groundwater, and let's say you had 1,000 units in your bucket and you use 300 units in 2026. Well, that 1,000 will now get subtracted by 300 and it'll be 700. Let's say you have 200 to add to the back end with the next year. Your new bucket going into 27 is now a 900. And you can see that when you're starting, you have room to grow and continue, but you're also going to be eating in, borrowing forward to some degree. That is what's being defined here under this total available allocation under 1.8.1. How that would be worked, and that would just be adjusted. Now, those adjustments are going to also be affected by the effective precip. Other water sources you might have that are playing into that. And in some cases, you might have the dairy operations are going to account in a certain way for animal facility operations. Production plant, processing plants that might be on parcel are going to also have to have an adjustment element because the remote sensing does not capture that use. And so there's adjustment elements that are talking about that for different functions on non-ag uses on land use and accounting for other sources of water, accounting for the effective precip. Those are to be built out as part of the monitoring that will end up with your bucket being defined each year as you go forward. You may also transfer water from somebody, and so that's going to be added to your bucket or subtracted depending on where you're going on some of those things. That's what 1.8 does. 1.9 is an opt-in process. I'm not going to go into any details since we have like 2 minutes left. 1.10 is enforcement. These are the authorities that Lloyd was mentioning about as reflected in Sigma. And then there's all the appeals and the list of appeals we're talking about that we need to try to find at least some of those. There's a litany of appeal types. I don't know if we can get through all of them. I think a couple of these things that are extra important, we can flag and try and address. Against some of that. Stop there. I appreciate you guys listening to my ranting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, I have one comment. You guys are right over.
Hold on, Buzz.
If what you're saying is this is not free charge, this is not perturbation of other. Sustainable use groundwater. Why do you have 1.8 counties with other sources of water?
So we're going to say you used 1,000 units. Or sorry, you have 1,000 units of allocation, groundwater allocation, and we see that you use 300, so we're gonna subtract 300. And you'll say, well, no, I also have this other source of water. Oh, okay, we won't subtract all of that from your allocation, but we need to be informed of that other source of water. That's what it's there for. So you're gonna say, I have
Other sources of sustainable yield native groundwater on.
other sources of non-allocation, groundwater allocation water. I have recharge water, I use that. I have surface water, I use that. Oh, okay, then your bucket of allocation.
This is anticipating that there would be recharge water.
We would say you will be reflecting recharge as recognized by another policy of the GSA. Just don't have that policy. You will be recognized to have surface water as provided and documented by the GSA.
So this is the nexus to other documents.
Yes.
Okay.
And if you know, Greg, one of the things I can see is coming.
It's already.
Yeah, it's headed through. Is if somebody has recharge and now they it's in a zone and they want to sell it to somebody in another zone. Well, you know, if that zone's got adverse effects, you know, some people that, you know, we're gonna have to be involved.